The Matthew 25 movement is a new national coalition of Christians across partisan lines who have come together to pledge to protect and defend the vulnerable in the name of Jesus. Who needs protection and defense? What do we mean by that? Well, we think that there are three groups that particularly need protection and defense at this historical moment: immigrants, African Americans in the criminal justice system, and other people of color, particularly young people, and the Muslim community. But this webinar and video is particularly going to focus on immigrants who need protection and defense at this historical moment. We have a broken immigration system. Most people in this country know that it's ineffective. If you get a step closer, you know that it's illogical. The DMV or the IRS to the 100 millionth power in terms of its insanity. And if you get a step closer than that, you know that it's profoundly inhumane. We have had several bipartisan solutions, two in particular, that would have solved many of the worst problems in the system. They garnered about 75% support in surveys nationally from the American public, but we have not had the political will to pass them. So instead, we've had a number of regulatory workarounds, which have made the system a little less illogical and significantly less inhumane. The recent executive orders from President Trump's administration are gutting those regulatory protections. So let's go into that in a little more depth. An order that we've had since the Morton Memo of August of 2010 gives guidelines for a prioritization of enforcement. What does that mean? It means that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has limited resources, and it focuses its resources on those whom it considers a threat to public safety. So if there's a mother who's been here for 20 years with 3 citizen children, who's been working hard the whole time, and there's a drug dealer, they will focus their resources on the drug dealer, and they will let that mother know, if she applies, that she is a low priority for detention and for deportation. So we've had this prioritization of enforcement, which by the final years of President Obama's administration was resulting in about 90% of the people being detained and deported having committed serious crimes, having been convicted of serious crimes. The President Trump's administration has included in the definition of criminal not only people who have committed serious crimes or even people who have committed minor crimes, but people who have been accused of a crime but not convicted, and people who have committed a chargeable offense as determined by the local ICE agent who is in their presence. There is no definition to chargeable offense. It's whatever that ICE agent thinks is a chargeable offense, or, says or, if he thinks that that person may be a threat to public safety. Again, no definition. And in the most recent pending guidelines that clarify those terms, that can include any person that is undocumented or that the ICE agent believes to be undocumented and does not have papers on him or her that show their documentation. That's called collateral damage, that they come looking for a person that they think has committed a crime, and there are other people in the vicinity who don't have papers on them, and they detain and deport those people. Just to give you a sense, there's quite a bit more than that in the executive orders, but just to give you a sense of how mean these orders are. I don't know any other word for it. There is an order that particularly has to do with the unaccompanied migrants, the children and youth, most of whom are fleeing the violence, the escalating violence in Central America. Those children and youth typically arrive at our border. They're picked up by the Border Patrol, and they ask for asylum, which is essentially refugee status without refugee benefits, that they have to show that they have a credible fear of fleeing violent persecution in their own country, and then they're detained, typically until a sponsor can be found for them. A sponsor is often a relative or a family member. This particular portion of the executive order says that they are going to prioritize these unaccompanied children and youth for processing. Processing means going through the court system to decide whether they could be deported and whether they could stay. Our statistics show currently that if these children and youth have legal representation, about 77% of them qualify for asylum. Unfortunately, we don't supply free lawyers to people seeking political asylum, even if they're children and youth. So it often takes some time to find them legal representation. So to say that we're going to make them priorities for processing means that they're on the fast track for deportation. The most recent clarification of the order says that undocumented people who offer to be sponsors, so if they have family members or guardians who are undocumented, that those people will be detained and deported. So it will be much harder to find them sponsors. And the sponsors will often not be able to be family members. So we have quite a few people, as you can see, in need of protection and defense. How can we protect them and defend them? Well, the only real answer is to change federal public decisions by changing hearts and minds. And the only way that we really know historically to change our hearts and minds is to amplify the voices of those who are most affected, to reveal what it means to say that we have a broken system that is profoundly inhumane, and to let people know that there are potential solutions, bipartisan solutions. And then in that context, to call our nation to obedience to God, which is really one of our callings as Christians. It's one of our callings in terms of our public witness. However, that may take some time to accomplish. And as we're doing that, there are some other activities that we can do that help with protection and defense. One is that we can advocate for a local safety net that replaces the national safety net that has been shredded. If we obtain that local safety net, we can advocate for individuals and families. We can provide pastoral and practical support to those who are in need of protection and defense. And sometimes we need to, and we can, operate a rapid response network so we can get to the people who need us in a timely manner. Lastly, we can offer shelter, which is often referred to as sanctuary. So I'm actually going to start by explaining sanctuary because people are talking about it, and I think there's often quite a bit of confusion about what it entails and where it comes from. What is sanctuary? Sanctuary has biblical roots. It comes from Numbers 25. Let's read it together. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger, so that anyone accused of murder may not die before they stand trial before the assembly. This is a response. This is God's response to a particular societal problem. In this case, there is a person who has committed manslaughter. He has killed someone accidentally, but he is being treated as if he has committed murder. Life for a life. So there are people seeking to kill him. God instructs the people of God to create cities of refuge so that that person will be protected until they can receive a fair hearing. This is God's remedy for an unjust response to a crime. Protection until there can be a fair hearing. When people say to me, what is it about illegal that you don't understand? My response is often, what is it about cruel and unusual punishment that you don't understand? We aim to have a system in the United States where the punishment fits the crime and where cruel and unusual punishment is not allowed. That's the situation that sanctuary is meant to respond to. Now, sanctuary was created as a biblical concept, of course, but it's been used in secular contexts as well. And it's been used in secular contexts for a very long time. It's not new. We've had Special Order 40 in Los Angeles since 1979. It was not created as a way to help immigrants. It was created as a way to make law enforcement more effective because immigrants were not testifying when they were victims of crime. So the chief of police, Darrell Gates, at the time, a very conservative chief of police, really pushed for the separation of immigration enforcement and local police enforcement so that victims would feel free to testify, so that police could go after the people that had harmed them. This is the technical definition. A sanctuary city is the city in the United States or in Canada that has adopted a policy of protecting undocumented immigrants by not prosecuting them solely for violating federal immigration laws in the country in which they are now living illegally. Such a policy can be set out expressly or observed only in practice. The term applies generally to cities that do not use municipal funds or resources to enforce national immigration laws, and usually forbid police or municipal employees to inquire about a person's immigration status. However, the definition has no precise legal meaning. When you don't do this, you have a situation like the situation that we just had under the new executive orders in Texas, where there was a woman in court to testify against someone who she's claiming had committed domestic violence. And ICE came to the court and they picked her up and they detained her. So the next woman who is suffering from someone who has committed domestic violence in Texas is not going to court. So we can see the use of sanctuary in a municipal context. So now I want to talk about sanctuary's use in a religious context in the 20th century, which was the last time before the current movement that the concept of sanctuary was used. And it was used around the refugees fleeing Central American civil wars. So I need to give you a little bit of history. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Guatemala, and in the 70s and 80s in El Salvador, there were land reform wars. When the Spanish conquered Latin America, they gave huge land grants to certain families. So in El Salvador, at this particular point, for example, 90% of the land was owned by 14 families. And the people who worked that land had to give a very high percentage of their profits from their crops to the landowner. So it was a feudal system. So people began to rebel against that feudal system. Initially, there was some hope that the United States would be an ally in fighting feudalism. But at the time, the Secretary of State had a brother who was the head of United Fruit. And United Fruit had a very close relationship with the 14 families. And so we took the side of the 14 families as a country and supported them. And as a result, we were in the middle of the Cold War. Russia took the side of the revolution, and it became natural and easy for the Reagan administration to call this a communist revolution, even though in fact we were also in the middle of the heyday of liberation theology. And much of the church had switched sides from its historic support of the 14 families to supporting the people struggling for land reform. So many of the people who were struggling for land reform were not communists. They were Christians. They were active members of base Christian communities. And when the government went after the revolutionaries, they also very specifically went after the base communities. So we know, of course, that Archbishop Romero was killed at the altar by a death squad sponsored by the government. We also know, many of us, that at a particular point in time, if you were a catechist for a base Christian community and you were carrying a Bible, that you were a candidate to be disappeared and killed. When it got that bad, we had people fleeing. We had about 500,000 people flee over a 10-year period, and many of them were serious committed Christians. And when they fled, they ran to the churches and they cited Numbers 35. Numbers 25. They asked for refuge. They asked for sanctuary. And churches responded. By the end of the sanctuary movement, about 500 churches had offered shelter, protection, and defense to the refugees fleeing Central America. And they had publicly shared their stories and made a case for them. It was an enormously effective movement. By making a sacrifice to stand with these individuals and families, we were able to change public opinion so that public opinion no longer saw them as communists, but understood what they were actually fleeing and who they actually were. And we were able to do two things in the process. One is that we were able to change our asylum law, because at that particular point, we had different asylum criteria when they first began to arrive for countries that were our opponents and countries that were our allies. If you were coming from Russia or Cuba, you could be a ballet dancer that wanted to live in the United States and you could get political asylum. If you were coming from Guatemala in 1980, only about 5% of Guatemaltecos were able to get political asylum, even though we had footage from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International of people who were sent back, taken off the plane, and shot. So we had a lot of evidence, but it was very, very hard to get political asylum. So one of our wins was to change our political asylum system so that we now have a standardized criteria for political asylum from anywhere in the world. We were also we played a significant role in stopping the funding for the wars in Central America. When we stopped them, not a single country in Central America became communist. We had one country, Nicaragua, which had a more leftist government. But Guatemala, for example, just had a democratic government. So many of the claims of the Reagan administration were just inaccurate, alternative facts. But we were able to make that point effectively, and we were able to win. Now, the sanctuary movement was prosecuted. We were infiltrated, and there was a grand jury trial. The legal argument, that was the central legal argument, was that we were in compliance with international law, since we have a pact that goes back to the end of World War II with countries all over the world to accept refugees. And so the sanctuary movement said we were in compliance with that pact. Whether that was the winning legal argument or not, there was only one conviction. There were no convictions for what is called harboring, which is actually providing shelter. There was only a conviction for transporting across the state line. So that was the Central American sanctuary movement of the 80s. In 2005, the House in Congress, not the Senate, but the House, passed the Sensenbrenner law. The Sensenbrenner law would have made it a felony to be undocumented or to help or serve an undocumented person, and it was written very vaguely. So it could even be construed, some lawyers thought it could be construed to cover baptism, any kind of ministry. So when Sensenbrenner passed, because our immigration system has been increasingly broken for 30 years, there were people all over the country who were part of the fabric of our communities who suddenly were profoundly terrified, in deep grief, because they considered themselves to be part of the community and they were suddenly about to become felons. And then we were trying in the churches to desperately to figure out, well, how do we respond? And Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles, he was the Archbishop of Los Angeles at the time, on Ash Wednesday of 2006, preached a sermon where he called on Catholics across the country to continue to minister to everyone, regardless of their immigration status, even if they were to go to prison for it. So he essentially called for a new sanctuary movement. And hearing that, we responded. Because he really did impact public opinion. The Sensenbrenner did not pass the Senate, largely because of the wave of impact that he started. So we decided that if we really grew the sanctuary movement, that we could achieve comprehensive immigration reform. So by the time we got going, the sanctuary movement was in 37 cities. But we were facing a very, very different situation from the first sanctuary movement, in that the 500,000 people who arrived here had nothing. They had no job, they had nowhere to stay, they had no medical insurance, they didn't speak any English. They really needed to be resettled. When we got around to the second sanctuary movement, most of the people we were trying to help were working, had somewhere to live, had children in school, were integrated into their communities, the last thing they wanted to do was to live in churches. So what we did was we got a small number of families who had really powerful stories, and we worked with them. They were deeply committed Christians, most of them. We worked with them in prayer and discernment until they decided that they would go into sanctuary, even though in many ways it was a hardship for them, to try to change public opinion. So they went into sanctuary in all of these different cities. And we did make a real impact. We got enormous press coverage. But as you heard earlier, we did not win comprehensive immigration reform. And when we did not win it, it was very clear that we had to recalibrate the sanctuary movement. We had to have a different focus because we really thought we were going to win. And we had no exit strategies for most of these families. So we really began to focus on regulatory reform, which is part of how we were able to achieve the prioritization of enforcement that I just discussed in the last slide. Over time, we were also able to achieve a policy known as sensitive zones, which said that ICE would not go into a church or a school or a hospital without a judicial warrant, so that people could feel safe in those situations. A judicial warrant, of course, is if they know that a particular individual has committed a serious crime. So, by the way, DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which affects young people who were brought to this country as small children, is a form of what we call deferred deportation, which is what's available through the prioritization of enforcement for individuals and families on a case-by-case basis. So you can go and you can say, I should be a low priority for enforcement, and you can apply as an individual or family. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals made that kind of protection available to a class of people, which were kids, most of them in college, some of them in the military, who had been brought here as young children, who we had invested in through our public school system and who wanted to give back. And many of those young people have benefited from DACA. DACA, of course, the president has said that he has a heart for those kids, but one of the new guidelines talks specifically about getting rid of all categories of special protection. So there's a little bit of a double message coming around that. Not one sanctuary, the new sanctuary movement, has not had one individual or church prosecuted. We do have some legal arguments beyond the original one. We really want to talk about the separation of church and state, and there have been some briefs done on that allow us to minister to undocumented people, which is essentially what we're doing. We always openly admit that people are staying with us, so we're not concealing them. And we are not trying to perpetrate their illegal presence in this country. We are seeking to help them gain legal status. So we think that all of those legal arguments should keep us safe from prosecution for harboring, but we don't know whether that's true in this new administration. So we really need, if you want to offer sanctuary, you need to be courageous. So let me talk about what offering sanctuary entails. There's two different kinds of sanctuary. It's private sanctuary and public sanctuary. Private sanctuary usually is offered for a short period of time. An individual or family is rarely frightened for some reason of immediate deportation. They come and they stay in the church for a short time where we try to get them a legal assessment. We try to figure out what their chances are for some kind of legal resolution of their case. And then whether or not they have that legal resolution, they then leave sanctuary with some kind of plan for how they want to take care of themselves. If we find a story that is particularly compelling, where the person wants to actually go through the hardships of leaving everything they know and living in sanctuary for an undetermined period of time, then a church might want to do public sanctuary, which is really the only way that we can impact public opinion and change hearts and minds. In terms, private sanctuary will not do that. If you want to do public sanctuary, you need to have a really revelatory story that makes it worth the cost, because the cost is very high, not only for the family, but also for the church. You really can't do it unless you have a coalition of supporting churches, which helps you financially support the family, helps you provide security for the family, and helps you provide pastoral care. Unless you have legal support, so that you have a potential exit strategy so that you don't end up with house arrest for the rest of their lives. And you have to have a media strategy. So it's costly, it's cumbersome, but it can have great power. It's the one consistent strategy. It's the one strategy that we can particularly do as Christians that gives us ongoing media attention. They're more interested in our provision of sanctuary than anything else that I've ever seen. So that's what sanctuary is. Sanctuary, obviously, like we said earlier, is not the only thing that you can do. You can work on a local safety net. There are basically 3 kinds of local safety nets. One is non-collaboration with ICE. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these in more depth. The second one is funding for legal services. And if you're thinking about providing sanctuary, you really need to think about the funds used for the family that would be in sanctuary in comparison to the amount of people that you could help legally with those same funds. The reason why you still might choose sanctuary is because our system is so broken that there are many people who cannot be helped legally, even though they've been in this country for a long time. They are contributors on every level. They are woven into the fabric of our country, and they have citizen children or citizen spouses. There are people in that situation that do not qualify for any form of administrative relief. Many people. And any kind of legal relief. So it may make sense to do sanctuary because legal relief is so hard to get, but it also may make sense to just pay for lawyers. So that's a decision that your coalition will need to make. And hopefully some of you can do some of both. But funding for legal services and advocating for that kind of funding from local government, state government, local foundations is a really important thing to do. The Family Council in Los Angeles helped us originally, actually before there was a national prioritization, it helped us to obtain a regional prioritization of enforcement. The Family Council consists of legislators, immigrant rights leaders, and faith leaders. And we go together to speak to the field officer of ICE regionally about how he's implementing policy in our region. So how can he use his prosecutorial discretion to have a system that's more logical and more humane? We are working on that. We'll see how far we get under this administration, but it's certainly a strategy you can try. Grass tops faith leaders go in to actually have the meeting, but you can get, of course, pastors and congregation members all over the place to sign onto a letter. You can also get interfaith allies to sign onto a letter that you can send in, with the leaders. I do want to back up just for a minute, and I do want to tell you that if you want to provide sanctuary, there is a website for the new sanctuary movement called sanctuarynotdeportations.org that has many more details on sanctuary than I've given you so far in this webinar. So just want to underline that. But beyond sanctuary, we're talking now about building a local advocacy initiative that will help you to try to create a local safety net. The other way that you can offer local protection is through rapid response. We're going to talk about that in more depth. Through the preparation of deferred deportation packets and the deferred deportation process, which, like I want to underline again, doesn't officially exist, but we may be able to get it back on a local level. And also to help with getting people who are refugees from Central America and other asylum applicants to help in filling out their asylum applications, and also in bond support to help them get out of detention. All of these I'm going to go into more detail right now. So the first one, when you hear about local law enforcement not collaborating with ICE, there's a number of different ways that can be shaped. The most common one, it has to do with ICE detainers, where ICE says you have to keep a person who may be undocumented after they've served whatever time they have, or after they've been picked up and detained by local law enforcement. You have to keep them until ICE can come and get them. ICE detainers have been ruled unconstitutional and illegal by multiple federal courts around the country. There are 5 states that have policies against collaboration with ICE in some form, 514 counties, and about 38 to 47 cities, depending on how you count it. Here is a policy that you can read. This PowerPoint will be available, of course, to anybody who would like to have it as a supplement for the webinar, so you can see this for yourself. But this is a policy that protects sensitive zones. This is ICE's own words about why the prioritization of enforcement makes sense to them. I just want to read it out loud because I think it's important, because we need to fight for this. ICE only has resources to remove approximately 400,000 aliens per year, less than 4% of the estimated illegal alien population. In light of the large number of administrative violations the agency is charged with addressing and the limited enforcement resources the agency has available, ICE must prioritize the use of its enforcement personnel, detention space, and removal resources to ensure that the removals the agency does conduct promote the agency's highest enforcement priorities, namely national security, public safety, and border security. To that end, the following shall constitute ICE's civil enforcement priorities. So you can see their rationale for this. So these, when we have deferred deportation, you can actually help individuals in your congregation, individuals that you minister with, to prepare a deferred deportation packet so that if they are ever detained, they do have a basis on which to argue for regulatory relief. So here's some of the positive factors that you will list and that you will provide supporting documents for if you're preparing that deferred deportation packet. Along with this webinar, we will send you a sample packet so that you can sit down with people in your congregation and prepare this. In addition to actually being potentially extremely useful, it's also a very important way of ministering to people's panic, because it is something positive that they can do. So you can see that, again, you can look at this in more detail, but it basically falls into three categories. One is, how long has the person been here, and what are their ties like in the United States? So, do they have close relationships with citizens, maybe even relationships where those citizens are depending on them? Do they have children who are citizens? Do they have a spouse who's a citizen? Now, you may think that having children that are citizens allows them to apply for status in this country, but it doesn't unless those children are over 21. And not even having a spouse always allows that. And I have another webinar that I'm doing on our broken immigration system, which will give you some more of the details for why that's true. But it really does help with deferred deportation. Deferred deportation, I just want to clarify that phrase a little bit. It basically means that ICE has used its prosecutorial discretion to say you're at the bottom of the priority list, and therefore you will not be detained or deported for the space of 1 year. And then every year you come back and it's renewed. And there are several different forms that can come in. Anyhow, so the first factor that's important, or set of factors, has to do with how long you've been here and what your ties are in this country. The second set of factors has to do with your contribution to this country. Are you working? Have you been working? Are you a volunteer? Are you a wonderful human being who has really helped your church, who has really helped your community? The third category has to do with humanitarian reasons for not going back to your home country. Do you have a medical condition in this country that could not be treated in your home country? So those are the kinds of factors that people look like. And like I said, you can see these in details looking at the PowerPoint that we'll send you. The negative factors have to do with whether or not you've committed actual serious crimes and whether or not you've been affiliated with a gang. Now, in the church, we do believe in repentance and conversion and rehabilitation. So we would argue, and we have actually argued successfully with the help of a lawyer. You do need a lawyer if you have any of these negative factors, even for deferred deportation. We have argued successfully in deferred deportation processes that someone really has been transformed. But it is still very, very difficult to argue for this if someone actually has committed a crime. So let me say something about asylum. Like I said before, the definition of asylum is credible fear of violent persecution in your home country as a result of your race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, political opinion, or membership in a particular group. Comes out of the Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, looking at what happened to people in that time and place that caused them to become refugees. As you can see, it doesn't quite fit the modern world in that what is causing the problem in Central America are international mafias that gain their money from drugs trafficking, human trafficking, guns trafficking, extortion of small businesses. That when a gang like that or the international mafia has killed your siblings or your parents in front of you, that isn't membership in a particular group. That isn't any one of these categories. And so it really does take a lawyer. That's why it's so important to obtain lawyers for these kids. It really does take a lawyer to prove that you fit in this category. But if you have a lawyer, you can prove it in many cases. You need to, if a person fills out an asylum application, that will actually keep them safe from being deported back to a place where they're likely to be killed for quite some time as the asylum process goes through the courts. Nationally, Catholic Charities often has reputable lawyers for low cost. Carecen is a national organization that often has the same resource. And if you want to find an individual lawyer that is reputable, which is very important because there are a lot of people taking advantage of immigrants seeking asylum, you can go to this website, immigrationlawhelp.org. Now, I have included information that I'm not going to go into in detail about sanctuary campuses. Because campuses have a number of students who currently have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, a number of campuses around the country are getting involved right now in trying to protect and defend their students. These are a list of the sanctuary campuses' potential promises. None of those promises are actually illegal. None of them break a single law. And currently, municipalities and campuses cannot be punished in the way that President Trump is threatening to punish them financially if they have not, in fact, broken any laws. So we are really going to see what happens with this picture. But campuses in particular, according to various lawyers that we consulted, do not have to worry about that at this time. Now I want to talk about rapid response. At this particular point, there is panic throughout the immigrant community because people can be picked up anywhere at any time. So we have done a lot of deliberation about how can we respond to people who are in that terrible state of panic and anguish and grief. And part of what we need to do is to try to figure out if there's a way to respond to them as quickly as possible if ICE comes to their door. So we've just given a few guidelines here. Our rapid response system in Southern California is not finished. We're still in process, but we did want to give you some of the ideas that we're working on. The first step that you can do is you can help people before ICE shows up at their door, long before, to prepare a family plan. And a family plan is a way of figuring out ahead of time and creating a document for how what will happen to your children if you have American citizen children and you are not a citizen and you are detained and deported. What is going to happen to your child? You need to have a notarized statement. If you go to ilrc.org, they have an affidavit that is a form that you can use to fill out, but you need a notarized statement saying where your children are going to go. And churches can be the entity that would be authorized to pick up the children if the parents are deported. So you know that that's a ministry that you can do. And helping people to create their family plan is something that you certainly can do. And there's quite a bit of information that should be in the family plan. So please do look up ilrc.org and find the affidavit if you're going to help families fill this out. Secondly, you have to help people to know their rights. If ICE comes knocking on the door and they don't have a warrant, people do not have to open the door. And in fact, ICE is really, so far, not allowed to bust down the door if they don't have a judicial warrant. So that does buy the family some time to call on the pastors who are part of the Rapid Response Network or the Christian leaders to come and to be present, to pray and to document, which can be very, very powerful, maybe even for that person, but certainly for the larger cause. So you have the right not to open your door. If they stop you on the street, you have the right to remain silent, and you should not sign any document that might result in your quote-unquote voluntary deportation. So those are some of the rights that undocumented immigrants have, and you should make sure that people know their rights. There are a number of excellent Know Your Rights workshops online that you can use. We are setting up a hotline. Currently, we have a hotline. We have a couple of different hotlines that go to recording, but we're really trying to set up a hotline that's 24 hours that go directly to a person so we can find out quickly what's going on. In Philadelphia, they have a text number. People can text and it automatically calls out without going through an agency or an organization. It automatically contacts about 1,000 people who could come out in a particular area. One of the difficulties with that is that sometimes we have false alarms. And if you work through organizations, then those false alarms can be gotten rid of by people verifying, so that the lawyers actually receive the call, they verify, and they contact support. So those are your two options. You can use a hotline or a text service. When you go out, you go out to film, you go out to pray. And if you get there too late, you can always investigate the situation and provide pastoral support to the family. We're also looking at having an ongoing prayer vigil at the detention center so that we do see what's going on and that we can report on it as needed. That's your webinar. If you have any questions, you are welcome to contact me, Alexia, Alexia, at alexiasalvatierra.com. And I was involved as a young person in the Central American Sanctuary Movement. I was one of the co-founders of the New Sanctuary Movement in 2006-2007, and I am an advisor with the current Sanctuary Movement, as well as being one of the leaders nationally, part of the Signal Committee for Matthew 25. So I am committed to supporting anyone who wants to be part of the Matthew 25 movement in any way. Thank you for your attention.